I'd argue every Final Fantasy world runs on the same unsustainable machine. From Midgar's neon skyline to Shinra's Mako reactors to a life stream that has been draining since 1997. The people flipping those light switches never see the bill coming due. That's why today, I'm walking through every major Final Fantasy world and the one architecture I think they share. Starting with the world that put that argument in its most iconic form. Gaia? Square Enix's own sales ledger puts Final Fantasy VII at more than 10 million copies worldwide, the best-selling single-player entry the mainline series has ever produced. That success is built on a world that is, by design, killing itself one reactor at a time. Midgar looks like the future. 8 Mako reactors ring the city, steel and neon stacked on plates that hang over slums where the sun barely reaches. Shinra's version of electricity is siphoning, pulling raw Mako, the planet's own life energy, out of the ground and routing it through turbines that double as magic batteries. Materia, weapons, street lamps, all of it runs on the same fluid. That fluid has a second job outside the power grid. The life stream carries the souls of everything that has ever died on Gaia, cycling them back into new life. Mako is that same stream, tapped and bottled before it finishes the trip, which means every reactor humming under Midgar is plugged straight into the planet's own version of an afterlife. Some uncomfortable HR questions never get asked. The northern crater is where that stream pools thick enough to see, a wound in the planet's crust. The resource running low on Gaia is the planet itself, drawn down one reactor at a time, and Shinra's balance sheet climbs every time the planet's reserve drops. The kid clocking into a reactor job for a paycheck is, without knowing it, financing the machine bleeding out the ground he stands on. Follow the math and there's only one reading. Every reactor Shinra activates subtracts time from the planet's clock as surely as it adds power to the grid. Gaia has spawned more direct sequels and prequels than any other single Final Fantasy setting, stacked across 2 decades. Proof that this particular extinction clock struck a nerve the franchise never stopped picking at. Gaia at least lets you watch the meter drop. The next civilization buries its own countdown somewhere you can't read a gauge for it, inside bloodlines and doctrine and whoever currently holds the crown, so nobody agrees there's a problem until the ground is already gone. Ivalice. Ivalice is the Final Fantasy world where the apocalypse most visibly wears a crown and sits in a council chamber. Most of the other realms on this list run on a machine, a crystal, or a planet leaking its own lifeblood into the open. Ivalice runs on paperwork, inherited titles, and a church whose blessings tend to land on whichever army is currently winning. Gaia's threat was a meter you could watch drain underground. Ivalice hides that same math inside treaties, dynasties, and doctrine, written so the cost never quite makes it onto the page. Final Fantasy Tactics and Final Fantasy XIII share this setting, along with several spin-offs, and both excavate the same kind of political rot, just wearing different armor. Tactics runs on the Church of Glabados, a religious order that turns out to be sheltering demons called Lucavi inside its holiest relics. 12 runs on the Arcadian and Rosarian empires, grinding the kingdom of Dalmasca between them like a coin they both want to keep. Airships fill the skies in both games, gleaming proof that Ivalice's engineers can build almost anything. The decisions that start and end its wars often happen in smaller rooms, over things like inheritance disputes in forged scripture, and an engineer's voice rarely carries weight in those rooms. A conscript pulled into Dalmasca's resistance dies defending a kingdom whose royal family is still arguing about succession, killed by soldiers, tax collectors, and priests who all answer to an empire he will never actually see. That is Ivalice's real resource, legitimacy, the belief that a crown or a scripture deserves obedience, mined by every major faction until it collapses under whoever happens to be standing on it. Strategy games about ambitious lords, political epics about empires justifying conquest, spin-offs that keep circling back to courtrooms and cathedrals. Taken together, the whole body of work reads like one civilization interrogating itself. Ivalice plays less like a single game world and more like a stage Square Enix returns to for stories where the institutions themselves become the disaster. Fans sometimes argue over whether Tactics or 12 owns Ivalice's real identity, and the argument rarely settles, because read together, both games seem to be excavating the same institutional rot from different depths. Gaia's threat came with a countdown clock ticking underground. Ivalice's version comes from a room full of people agreeing to believe a lie a little longer, no clock required. That same lie is about to get buried even deeper somewhere else, written straight into the dirt, the magic, and the manner of dying, until an entire civilization forgets it ever agreed to anything, and starts calling the arrangement faith Spira. Spira built an entire religion around a victory that has never actually happened. When Sin returns, a summoner completes a pilgrimage, faces a monster called Sin, and the faithful throw a festival for a triumph that quietly resets before the confetti clears. The gap between calms varies, sometimes a decade, sometimes centuries, long enough when the calm stretches centuries, for a child born after one triumph to grow up and send their own kid to die winning the same war again. The temple calls that rhythm devotion. Anyone counting the years would call it a maintenance schedule. Yevon runs public life on this rhythm. The church forbids advanced machina, preaches submission to Sin as punishment for humanity's reliance on machina, and names the pilgrimage the single highest calling a person can answer. Summoners travel from temple to temple across Spira's coasts and islands collecting the power to fight Sin, and that power comes from aeons, beings pulled from faith, people who gave up their bodies and became statues centuries ago so their essence could be summoned on demand. That essence moves through pyreflies, the same fragments of memory and soul that drift up from anyone who dies, and linger behind when someone is not sent. In Spira, loss feeds directly into the magic. Pyreflies, saturated with memory and sorrow, power the aeons a summoner calls, so grief itself seems to become fuel. 10 years before Final Fantasy X begins, the summoner Braska completed his pilgrimage and won Spira its latest calm. He did it through the final summoning, a rite that ends Sin by turning the summoner's own closest companion into its replacement. Braska's guardian Yecht became the next Sin that morning. Nobody sent out a memo. Grandmeister Mika, who ran Yevon's doctrine for centuries, knew it and said nothing. Yuna is Braska's daughter, and she walks the same road toward the same ceremony, learning step by step what the last one actually cost. Yevon's leadership maintains that arrangement knowingly. In effect, the doctrine channels loss into obedience, funerals into recruitment, each calm into an unspoken countdown. Yevon's clergy sustain the cycle knowingly, presiding over the doctrine that feeds it, and in that reading the population's grief and hope become its fuel, where Ivalis's ideology shaped the throne from a distance. That fusion is why Spira lands harder than most worlds in the series. In effect, Spira's religion, magic, and plot all seem to run on one idea. Grief turned into an institution that manufactures its own emergencies. In this reading, Spira is a world where the lie is load-bearing, stitched into the religion, the magic, and the root of the pilgrimage itself. But every world this video has covered so far has a border that holds still, one set of rules, a story that eventually ends. The next world never stopped growing, and the question worth sitting with is whether a world that keeps expanding can ever run out of the same resource all the others burn through. Eorzea. Eorzea is the only Final Fantasy setting that has already been destroyed once, on purpose, so the developers could rebuild it and of course keep the subscription running. Square Enix built that ending into canon. The 2010 launch of Final Fantasy XIV was broken badly enough to draw a public apology from its own producer. In 2013, the fix arrived dressed as an apocalypse. A moon called Dalamud cracked open, a primal named Bahamut leveled entire regions, and the surviving city-states rebuilt under a new name, a realm reborn. Alright, guess the servers needed a hard reset. No other game in this franchise has ever gotten. To blow up its own setting and call it a patch note. What survived the calamity is the closest thing the series has to a functioning government. Ul'dah runs on a sultana who answers to a merchant syndicate that answers to money, and money has opinions about tariffs, wars, and who gets arrested. Gridania answers to living elementals interpreted by Seedseers who can exile a citizen for felling the wrong tree. Limsa Lominsa answers to an admiral who earned the chair by outsailing everyone else who wanted it. 3 city-states, 3 completely different power structures spread across La Noscea, Thanalan, the Black Shroud, Coerthas, and Mordona. More mapped territory than Ivalis's feuding houses or Spira's single pilgrimage road ever needed. All of it runs on Aether. Aether casts the spells, summons the primals, and feeds the Aetherites that let you teleport across a continent for a fee measured in gil, roughly the price of a bowl of soup in Limsa, which is a more honest business model than any Mako reactor ever ran. When Aether runs thin and a calamity hits, you get Mordona, land still scarred years later, where farmers who once worked that soil now live in refugee camps waiting on ground that may never grow anything again. That is the same unpaid bill a Midgar line worker signed just by clocking in, wearing a different Crystal's logo. Eorzea never stopped billing. Ul'dah's ruling power has been contested since launch, its sultana nearly deposed, and its syndicate reshuffled more than once. Gridania's forests have burned and regrown. The Black Shroud from 2013 and the Black Shroud players walk through today are substantially different places, and fans still argue over which one counts as the real version, a debate the developers keep fueling by never letting either one sit still. Most earlier worlds in this franchise wrapped up their core story and were set aside. This one gets a new patch note every few months, which makes it the only place in the series where a civilization's relationship with its own dying resource keeps evolving while the subscription is still active. Players sometimes wonder which era is the real Eorzea. Follow the pattern far enough and the debate itself starts to look like the answer. A world too alive to sit still long enough to be summarized. Gaia burned through its Mako in one story and kept telling the aftermath across sequels. Spyra looped its sacrifice for 1,000 years and finally broke the cycle. Eorzea is still running the experiment live, ether draining and refilling in real time, with no ending screen anyone has been shown yet, which raises an uncomfortable question about the games that came generations before any of this, the ones nobody thinks of as building anything at all. Valisthea. Valisthea is a world that can tell you its time is running out. The Blight, a spreading catastrophe that sterilizes land and collapses ecosystems, is mapped, tracked, and advancing anyway, while the 6 nations spread across the continents of Storm and Ash and the surrounding islands are locked in conflict over the remaining viable ground, with little sign of the cooperation that might slow the Blight's advance. The Mother Crystals are why the fighting is so vicious. Enormous formations dense with ether, the source of all magic in Valisthea, the Mother Crystals underpin agriculture, infrastructure, and daily survival for every civilization on the map. Rosaria, Sunbreque, the Dhalmekian Republic, the Iron Kingdom, Wallode, and the Crystalline Dominion. Each major power is organized around proximity to a Mother Crystal the same way older civilizations organized around rivers. The farmer living within one's ether-rich radius simply calls it home, the thing that makes the soil grow and the lamps light, without thinking about what happens when it runs dry. The Blight is the answer to that question, arriving faster than anyone hoped. As it spreads, habitable land converts to dead zones, and the zones still viable are shrinking around the same Mother Crystals that are already finite. The states of Valisthea know the math is against them. The threat is confirmed by geography and by nations aware of their own dwindling reserves, a framing fans call unusual for the franchise. Earlier Final Fantasy worlds often buried the end inside ancient doctrine or a distant calamity. Valisthea's collapse reads as a planning problem out in the open, the Blight advancing across the map like a logistics document. Eorzea, one rung back on this ladder, showed a civilization cycling through catastrophe with an uncertain endpoint. Read next to that, Valisthea looks like the version that skips the cycle and puts the collapse in the opening hours, where earlier games might have saved a comparable revelation for later. Follow that pattern and Final Fantasy XV's political landscape reads as built around one question. What happens to nations when the window for pretending closes? The resource crisis framing, magic as a finite reserve depleting in real time under the weight of civilization, requires only reading what the game explicitly states. You can trace this same argument through the franchise's history, in different clothes each time. Valisthea reads as the version that strips the dressing away and leaves the load-bearing structure visible. You can trace this argument through earlier entries, where the load-bearing structure was often buried underneath the story rather than placed on the surface. Worlds from classic entries. The first Final Fantasy game was already ending before the opening dungeon. 4 crystals, one for each element, and every one of them dimming under a corruption that remains unnamed until the party walks up and touches it. That became the template the franchise would return to again and again, stitched into the very first cartridge in 1987, running on a world with a countdown already attached to it. The obvious read is that these early worlds are simple. Small continent, 4 crystals, a handful of heroes, save the world, roll credits. Final Fantasy V leans on that exact 4 crystal structure so hard the world itself splits in 2. As if to make room for a second set. But simple is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, because the machinery underneath is the same machinery many later games dress up and call new crystals that anchor the elements. Airships that shrink a continent down to a few minutes of travel time, a rough deal for the boat industry. A job system that lets 4 heroes become over 20 different specialists without changing a single face. Summoned creatures on loan from a power source the party channels without ever fully controlling. Final Fantasy the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, and the 9th all run some version of this exact toolkit, and that shared toolkit is a big part of why the franchise feels like one thing, even though every numbered entry drops you on a fresh planet. Plenty of fans have treated the numbered entries like chapters in one continuous saga. The numbering tracks separate installments, each landing on its own world with its own cast, and the rare games that do share a timeline say so directly the way Final Fantasy X's own sequel does. Look closely, and the connective tissue between Cornelia and Midgar and Spyra runs through the crystal, the airship, the job board, and the summon, rebuilt largely from scratch each time like a contractor reusing the same blueprint on a different lot. Somewhere on that blueprint, in world after world, there is a person who never asked to be collateral. Some farmer standing beside a crystal shrine that has been quietly cracking for years, told the light will hold because it has always held. It held right up until the plot needed a reason to send 4 heroes out the front door. Valisthea just put that farmer's job description on the label instead of burying it in flavor text. The classic games built the architecture, and many mainline worlds since have been fresh iterations of that design. But there is one category of Final Fantasy world that stops dressing up as a new continent and just opens the door on everything the franchise has already built, all stacked into the same room. Other iconic settings. Grimoire stacks monsters into towers and calls it a kingdom, and that ridiculous premise turns out to be the most honest cartography in the entire franchise. World of Final Fantasy builds its whole map around capturing creatures and shrinking heroes into chibi versions of themselves, then stitches that map to the Nine Wood Hills, a structure that treats locations from Final Fantasy history as floors you can visit rather than memories you're supposed to forget. Nobody pretends this is a new continent with its own harvest cycles and border disputes. It's a shelf, and the franchise finally admits it's been building shelves the whole time. Compare that to the pilgrimage road a summoner walks toward a death she already knows is coming, or the Mako paycheck a Midgar worker cashes without asking where the light in his ceiling fixture actually comes from. Those worlds dress the same architecture in Grief and Rent. Grimoire skips the costume. It just puts Bahamut, Ifrit, and a Cactuar in the same room and lets you catch them. That's the real function of these crossover spaces. They gather summons and monsters from a dozen different eras, drop them into one playable pocket, and let the franchise's own greatest hits stand next to each other without a plot excuse. Multiverse framing does the same job at a bigger scale, treating separate worlds as connectable realms instead of one shared planet, which sounds like an expansion of the lore and can be read as a confession. If these worlds can be plugged into each other this easily, they were less separate than their different names for magic and different maps made them look. Fans still argue about which of these count as a real Final Fantasy world versus an anthology playground wearing one, and that argument only exists because the crossover spaces make the pattern impossible to miss. Most mainline entries run the identical build: a crystal, a summon system, an elemental chart, and time and again, a civilization drawing power from a source that's already dying. Cocoon did it, Spyra did it, Midgar did it. The spin-off worlds just stop hiding the seams. Strip the names away, and most Final Fantasy worlds are the same room, crystals and all. The original games drafted that blueprint decades ago, and every continent since has been a fresh coat of paint over the same cracking foundation. Grimoire is the one setting willing to hang a sign on the door and tell you what's actually inside. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.